June 24, 1948. Stalin cuts every road, rail line, and waterway into West Berlin. 2.5 million people are about to starve. Truman's advisors give him two options: send in tanks and risk World War III, or abandon the city and prove America's promises mean nothing. Between nuclear war and humiliation, Truman chooses a third option that sounds completely insane. He's going to save an entire city from the sky. And in doing so, hands Stalin his first major defeat of the Cold War. Hit that like button right now if you want to hear how one impossible decision changed everything. Quick question: where in the world are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments. To understand how Truman ended up gambling on the craziest logistics operation in history, you have to go back to the ruins of 1945. When Nazi Germany surrendered in May 1945, the Allies didn't just topple Hitler and go home. They carved the entire country into 4 occupation zones: American, British, French, and Soviet. Each power got its own territory to govern, rebuild, and control. Deep inside the Soviet zone, hundreds of kilometers behind what would become the Iron Curtain, lay the old capital, Berlin, and by Allied agreement hammered out at conferences in Tehran, Yalta, and Potsdam. Berlin itself was also sliced into 4 pieces. That created an incredibly vulnerable situation: a small western enclave U.S., British and French sectors sitting like an island deep inside territory controlled by Joseph Stalin. At first, everyone smiled for the cameras. Big 3 victory photos, parades with flags from all 4 powers. Talk about cooperation and building a peaceful new Europe together. But between 1945 and 1947, the mood turned ice cold. Stalin moved quickly to install communist governments across Eastern Europe: Poland, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, East Germany. He was creating a belt of states loyal to Moscow, a buffer zone between the Soviet Union and the West. In Washington, Truman and his advisors watched as elections turned into one-party regimes. They watched as opposition leaders were arrested, intimidated, or forced into exile. They concluded that Soviet tanks and secret police were simply replacing Nazi ones. The promise of free and democratic elections that Stalin had agreed to at Yalta was being violated country by country. Then came 1947 and the Marshall Plan, a massive American program to pour billions of dollars, eventually over $13 billion, into rebuilding Western Europe. To Washington, it was economic rescue. A way to stabilize democracies, prevent communist parties from gaining power through economic desperation, and create prosperous trading partners. To Stalin, it looked like something else entirely: a hostile takeover, the American dollar buying influence, threatening his grip on a shattered continent. And right in the middle of this new Cold War fault line sat Berlin. The western sectors especially. West Berlin depended almost entirely on rail lines and roads that ran through Soviet-controlled East Germany. Every sack of flour, every ton of coal, every box of medicine, every drop of fuel had to cross territory Stalin controlled. He couldn't push American troops out with tanks. Not yet. Not without risking open war that even he didn't want. But he could squeeze. Slowly, by turning off the tap. Berlin was no longer just a ruined German city trying to rebuild. It was a pressure point, a test, a symbol of whether the Western Allies would keep their commitments or fold when things got difficult. And both sides knew it. Throughout late 1947 and early 1948, tensions escalated. Soviet officials began creating technical difficulties for Western convoys. Trains were delayed. Inspections became longer and more intrusive. Bureaucratic obstacles multiplied. The Western Allies, particularly the Americans and British, knew they needed to rebuild their zones of Germany economically. The old Reichsmark currency was a chaos of inflation and black markets. Without a stable currency, any hope of economic recovery was doomed. So in June 1948, they introduced a new currency, the Deutschmark. in the American, British, and French zones. For Stalin, a strong West German economy tied to the United States was a nightmare scenario. It would create a prosperous Western alternative right on his doorstep, making his Eastern European satellites look even worse by comparison. When the Western powers extended the Deutschmark into their sectors of Berlin deep inside the Soviet zone, Stalin treated it as a direct provocation. His answer came swiftly and brutally. Subscribe and turn on notifications because this crisis is about to explode. On June 24, 1948, Stalin stopped squeezing and slammed the door. Overnight, Soviet authorities announced that technical difficulties and traffic problems required closing all rail lines from the western zones into Berlin. Freight trains heading toward Berlin were turned back at the border. Trucks were halted at checkpoints. Barges on the canals were refused passage. Within hours, every rail, road, and water route feeding West Berlin from West Germany was shut down. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't temporary. It was a deliberate blockade. The message to Washington, London, and Paris was brutally simple. Abandon your plans for a unified Western Germany, or abandon this city. Almost immediately, the lights went out. The power plants that supplied electricity to West Berlin sat in the Soviet sector. And on the night of June 24th, their output to the western sectors was cut. Streetcars stopped moving. Refrigerators went warm. Workshops and factories fell silent. The hum of a functioning city died. Food stocks in the western sectors were measured in weeks. Coal reserves needed for cooking, heating, and power generation in days. The western garrisons had enough ammunition and military supplies, but that didn't matter if the 2.5 million civilians they were supposed to protect froze to death or starved. By closing railways, cutting roads, and shutting off power, Stalin had not just challenged the rights of the Allies in Berlin. He had placed a gun to the head of 2.5 million people and dared Truman to do something about it. In Washington, the crisis meetings began immediately. On paper, Truman had every legal right to smash through the blockade. The agreements made in 1945 guaranteed the Western Allies access to Berlin by designated highways, rail lines, and crucially air corridors. American generals could point to the documents and say, if our convoys are blocked, we send tanks to open the road. Simple as that. Some in the Pentagon argued exactly that position. Assemble an armored column, load it with supplies, drive it up the Autobahn toward Berlin. Dare the Soviets to fire the first shot. But everyone in that room knew what that gamble really meant. This was 1948, not 1914. Both sides were now nuclear powers in the making. The Soviet Union had just tested its first atomic bomb. The memory of World War II, which had ended only 3 years earlier, was still raw. If Soviet troops opened fire on an American convoy, could Washington really afford to back down? If U.S. bombers hit Soviet positions to protect their soldiers, could Moscow afford not to respond? A local clash over road access could spiral into something far worse, a Third World War. This time with strategic bombing, atomic weapons, millions dead. Truman understood the stakes perfectly. From the very beginning, there was another problem. The West was not yet locked together in a formal military alliance. NATO wouldn't be created until 1949. In mid-1948, France was exhausted from 6 years of war. Britain was nearly bankrupt, still rationing food and fuel. Much of Western Europe was still digging itself out of rubble. Few governments were eager to tell their war-weary populations, we may be going back to war. Over Berlin, in that climate, one miscalculation on an East German road could shatter European confidence in American judgment. Truman understood if he marched tanks toward Berlin and lost his nerve halfway, U.S. credibility would be destroyed forever. Every small nation caught between East and West would conclude that American promises were worthless. If he pushed through and the Soviets fought back, millions could die in a conflict nobody wanted. Yet doing nothing, accepting the blockade, and quietly pulling out would tell the world that Soviet pressure worked, and American commitments did not. Between triggering a nuclear catastrophe and swallowing humiliation, the president needed something else, something that looked almost impossible. A way to hold Berlin without firing a shot, without giving Stalin a pretext to start World War III. Here's a question for you. If you were facing two impossible choices, would you look for a third option or pick the lesser evil? Drop your answer in the comments. Truman's advisors kept searching for that third option. Something between surrender and Armageddon, but nothing made sense. Nothing seemed remotely feasible until General Lucius D. Clay the Tough, plain-spoken U.S. military governor in Germany, proposed what sounded like a logistical hallucination. If roads, rails, and rivers were closed, then supply the city entirely by air. Feed 2.5 million people using cargo planes. Replace every truck with a C-47. Turn the skies over Germany into a conveyor belt of life. No one in Washington believed it could work. Berlin needed at least 4,500 to 5,000 tons of food, coal, and medicine every single day just to stay alive, just to prevent mass starvation and collapse. That was more than any air transport operation in history had ever attempted. By far, coal alone seemed impossible. How do you fly in thousands of tons of dirty black rock through narrow air corridors in rain, darkness, and fog without losing planes and crews? Veterans of the European Air War remembered how easily bad weather could ground entire wings. How fog and ice killed more pilots than enemy fire. The airfields in Berlin-Tempelhof in the American sector and Gatow in the British sector were already stretched thin. In winter, they froze. In autumn, they drowned in fog. Even in summer, low clouds could force pilots into near-blind landings. The air corridors themselves were narrowly 20 miles wide and had to be shared with Soviet military traffic. One navigational error could trigger an international incident. Clay didn't pretend the plan was safe. He didn't claim it would be easy. He only insisted it was possible. And more importantly, it allowed the West to hold Berlin without firing a single shot. Truman listened to the briefings, listened to the objections, listened to advisors who said it was too risky, too expensive, too uncertain. Then he said the sentence that set the tone for the entire crisis. "We stay in Berlin. We are not leaving, no shouting, no theatrics." Just the calm finality of a man who had made up his mind. Within hours, orders went out across the U.S. military. The United States launched Operation Vittles. The British launched Operation Plainfare. C-47 Dakotas and larger C-54 Skymasters were pulled from every available theater. Pilots were recalled from leave. Mechanics began sleeping in hangars to keep aircraft flying around the clock. Flight schedules were drawn up, routes were planned, tonnage requirements were calculated and recalculated. On June 26, 1948, just 2 days after Stalin sealed the city the first, American transport plane descended through the clouds toward Tempelhof. Its wheels touched the runway. Inside, sacks of flour strapped 2 wooden pallets. That single landing was the start of one of the most audacious humanitarian gambles of the entire Cold War. It was risky, improvised, mathematically insane. But it carried Truman's signature, a refusal to abandon people who depended on America, and a willingness to confront Stalin without ever giving him an excuse to shoot. The Berlin airlift had begun, and the world was about to watch a silent war fought with cargo manifests instead of artillery. The first few weeks proved just how brutal that gamble would be. Early on, the airlift barely scraped together a couple of thousand tons per day, enough to keep Berlin from immediate collapse, but not enough to make anyone in Moscow nervous. The planes flew, the supplies came, but it wasn't sustainable, not yet. So the Americans and British did something very unglamorous and very American. They treated the whole operation like a factory problem. Every step was measured, timed, and refined. How long to unload a C-54? How many men needed to roll coal off the pallets? How fast could a pilot refuel, reload, and take off again? By autumn 1948, the airlift no longer looked like an emergency stunt. It looked like an assembly line in the sky. New procedures cut unloading times from 30 minutes to under 10 minutes. Ground crews worked under floodlights through the night. German civilians, the very people being saved, volunteered to haul sacks, sweep runways, fix pallets, do anything to shave seconds off the turnaround time. A third airfield Tegel in the French sector was carved out of rubble and marshland in record time, built largely by Berliners with hand tools and sheer stubbornness. The numbers exploded. By December 1948, the Western Allies were mounting around 1,400 flights every single day into the city. At the peak, a plane was landing or taking off in Berlin roughly every 30 seconds, day and night, in rain, in wind, in sleet, in fog. The sky over the city filled with the steady drone of engines, American C-47s and larger C-5 for Skymasters, British Yorks and Dakotas, all shuttling endlessly along the narrow air corridors agreed upon in 1945. Pilots joked that they were no longer flying individual missions. They're just bolts in a giant machine. Many slept in their seats between legs, grabbing a few minutes of rest while ground crews swarmed around the aircraft. Some made 3, 4, even 5 round trips in a single day. They became so familiar with the approach to Tempelhof or Gatto that they could almost fly it with their eyes closed, though they never dared. Each load seemed tiny, measured against the hunger of an entire city, but together the tonnage climbed. Coal for power plants, flour for bakeries, salt, medicine, machine parts, everything a city needed to survive. The airlift had turned into a relentless race against time, weather, and Soviet hopes that the West would simply run out of patience or fuel. Instead, the tempo kept rising, and so did Berlin's chances of survival. Yet, amid all the grinding logistics and roaring engines, the most unforgettable moment of the airlift came not from a general or a president. It came from a quiet American pilot with a camera around his neck. During a rare break on the ground at Tempelhof, Lieutenant Gail Halvorsen wandered over to the perimeter fence and found a group of Berlin children standing there, thin, polite, curious, determined not to beg. He started talking to them through the fence. They told him they didn't want food from him. They simply wanted freedom, something no plane could deliver. Touched by their calm dignity, these children, who had lived through war, starvation, and occupation without losing their humanity, Halvorsen reached into his pockets. He found 2 sticks of gum, tore them into pieces, handed them through the fence. He watched the children share them, literally passing around the wrappers to smell the sweetness. On the spot, he made a promise. The next time he flew over Berlin, he would drop candy for them. "How will we know which plane is yours?" one child asked. Halvorsen smiled. "I'll wiggle my wings." That tiny gesture became a legend. Before each approach to Tempelhof, Halvorsen would rock his C-54 from side to side. Children below would shout, point, and scatter as small parachutes made from handkerchiefs drifted down. Bundles of chocolate, gum, and sweets tied with string. Word spread like wildfire. Newspapers started calling him the Candy Bomber and Uncle Wiggly Wings. American schoolchildren back home mailed candy to Germany. Air crews donated their rations. Berliners began writing letters thanking the strangers who gave their kids something they hadn't tasted in years: joy. What Halvorsen did had zero effect on the tonnage charts pinned in the airlift command centers, yet it changed everything that numbers could not measure. In a city scarred by famine, bomb craters, and political fear, a handful of chocolate bars drifted down like symbols of a different future. One in which the West was not an occupying army, but a lifeline. His small parachutes became icons of hope in the earliest, coldest phase of the Cold War. And for Stalin, the optics were a nightmare. How do you crush a city when your rival is dropping candy to its children? If this story is hitting you right in the feels, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. The Berlin airlift was proving not just the strength of American logistics, but the power of American humanity. By early 1949, the blockade was no longer the trap Stalin had imagined. It was turning into an embarrassment. The tonnage charts told the story he didn't want to read. Week after week, the airlift not only survived, it improved. Coal deliveries climbed. Food arrivals stabilized. Medical supplies flowed. West Berliners, who were supposed to buckle under pressure, instead rallied around the Western powers. The very act meant to break their will was hardening it. Worse for Moscow, the global narrative was slipping out of Stalin's hands. The world was watching American and British planes dropping life-saving supplies into a city the Soviets were trying to freeze into submission. Instead of discrediting the West, the blockade was making the Soviets look like villains of the new era. Diplomatically, the pressure was rising too. Western unity rather than cracking was solidifying. In Washington, London, and Paris, the airlift had become a symbol of resolve. In Western Europe, it fueled support for a collective defense pact that would soon become NATO. Stalin found himself boxed in by his own strategy. If he escalated he tried to interfere with the air corridors agreed upon in 1945. He risked a direct clash with the United States, something even he didn't want. But if he continued the blockade, he only strengthened Truman's position and further alienated the Berlin population he hoped to win over or intimidate. After 11 months, it was clear. The blockade was not forcing the West out of Berlin. It was anchoring them there. So before dawn on May 12, 1949, without ceremony or apology, Soviet authorities reopened the roads, railways, and waterways into West Berlin. The blockade was over. Yet the airlift did not stop. Truman and General Clay kept it running until September 30, 1949, building up reserve stocks, making sure the city would never again be held hostage by a flick of Stalin's wrist. When the final tallies were made, the numbers were staggering. The Western Allies had flown more than 277,000 missions, delivered over 2.3 million tons of supplies, lost 101 lives, pilots and ground crew killed in accidents. Proven, in the most literal way imaginable, that Stalin had lost this battle of wills long before he admitted defeat. The sky had beaten the blockade. The West had held Berlin. And Harry Truman had earned one of the quietest yet most consequential victories of the Cold War. The end of the blockade did more than turn the lights back on in West Berlin. It rewired the entire map of post-war Europe. The Berlin airlift became the first clear Western victory of the Cold War, a showdown in which the United States and its allies had faced down Stalin without firing a single shot. That mattered enormously. For a war-weary Europe still recovering from 6 years of destruction. The sight of American and British planes risking fog ice and accidents day after day told a simple story. These were not occupiers waiting for an excuse to leave. They were partners willing to pay a price to stay. Confidence that had been shaky in 1945-46 hardened into trust. Politically, the airlift helped push Western governments toward something that had seemed unthinkable just a few years earlier: a permanent peacetime military alliance. In April 1949, while the airlift was still underway, 12 nations signed the North Atlantic Treaty, creating what would become known as NATO, a collective security pact built on the idea that an attack on one was an attack on all. The lesson of Berlin was woven into its DNA. Stand together, and Soviet pressure can be resisted. Inside Germany, the lines also sharpened. In 1949, the Western zones formally became the Federal Republic of Germany, West Germany, anchored economically to the Marshall Plan and politically to the Western Alliance. In response, the Soviets created the German Democratic Republic, East Germany, their zone. The division of Germany and of Europe was now not just an occupation arrangement. It was a long-term reality that would last for 4 decades. And at the center of this new order stood Harry Truman, the once dismissed compromise choice from Missouri, the haberdasher who supposedly didn't understand geopolitics, now widely seen as the man with steel in his spine. The Berlin airlift didn't make him popular in every poll. His approval ratings still fluctuated. But among historians, it would come to be remembered as his finest hour. The moment an unglamorous president quietly proved he could outwit a dictator. Final question before we wrap up. If you were Truman, would you have taken the gamble or chosen differently? Drop your answer in the comments. In the end, the Berlin airlift stands as one of those rare moments when power was measured not in divisions and warheads, but in sacks of flour and chocolate bars drifting from the sky. A ruined city that had helped start the deadliest war in history was kept alive not by conquest, but by mercy. Day and night, the air over Berlin hummed with transport planes. On the ground, children craned their necks to spot the wiggle of Gail Halvorson's wings. And far away in Washington, a plain, bespectacled president refused to sign the order that would have let Berlin die quietly in the dark. Harry Truman was never a grand strategist in the way historians like to romanticize. He was a former farmer and haberdasher who believed stubbornly that a promise meant something. That abandoning Berlin would mean abandoning every small nation caught between empires. And with it, the very idea of a free world. His answer to Stalin was not a brilliant new doctrine. It was simply staying put, paying the cost, trusting that decency could be a form of strength. That's why the airlift still speaks to us today, long after the runways have gone quiet. It reminds us that sometimes the bravest choice isn't the loudest one. Sometimes it's the choice to stay, to feed, to protect, to refuse to abandon people simply because it's difficult or expensive or risky. Truman didn't defeat Stalin with tanks or bombs. He defeated him with flour and coal and chocolate bars falling from the sky. He proved that you don't always need violence to win. Sometimes you just need resolve. If this story changed how you think about leadership and courage, smash that like button right now. Every like tells YouTube to show this to more people who need to understand that strength comes in many forms. Subscribe and hit that notification bell, because next week we've got another story about an impossible choice that changed history crazy. Military innovation that killed 3,000 enemy soldiers in 15 minutes and won a war everyone thought was lost. Drop your location in the comments. Tell us if you've ever had to choose between bad options and found a third way. Just let us know you're here. Thank you for watching. And remember, when someone gives you 2 terrible choices, sometimes the right answer is to create a third one nobody thought was possible. That's what Truman did. That's what changed the world.